Hello, everyone. I think I know all of you, but just as an introduction for the recording, my name is Hannah. I'm a philosophy and English double major, and I am a junior. This is my presentation for my personal philosophy that I've been writing for the philosophy capstone. My project is titled Saving Rationality for reasons that you will soon hear. And it's currently on the last slide. If you'll excuse me, I'll actually put it on the start. So to begin, there's a base level accusation at the heart of this project that is very simple, that rationality is an invention to keep certain people in power and to oppress others. For the purposes of this presentation, I'll very much be looking at rationality in terms of what it means as a human construct. And the flip side to that is also looking at what irrationality means in terms of a human construct. My issue with rationality is that it has somehow tricked us into thinking that we needed to survive, and in doing so, has painted irrationality in a very negative light. This capstone is me trying to save irrationality, but by exploring ways we can accept it more into society. This involves a lot of thought about social norms and human behavior, as well as questions on disability, race, and gender. At the start, I found it very difficult to determine a definition of rationality, but in the process of working on this capstone, I thought of a clever little anecdote that really helped me determine a good definition for rationality. To kick this off, I have to say that I am very, very bad at math. I really struggled with math in elementary school, even the tiniest concepts. A lot of times I could manage to get the right answer, but I would get the problem wrong because I got the answer the wrong way. I hate the process of having to show my work so they knew I was thinking the way they wanted me to, and it really stifled a lot of my chances at succeeding in math because I just couldn't solve the problems the right way. And rationality is a little bit like that. Rationality markets itself as the only way to get the right answer. You'll get a big fat F if you try to get that answer any other way. Irrationality, in turn, is all the other pathways you can use to solve the problem and to get the right answer. I'm really happy with this definition for two reasons. First and foremost is that it recognizes that rationality and irrationality are both just different ways to get to the same place without categorizing one as good or bad. Secondly, is that it recognizes that there isn't something inherently better about rationality, it's just been chosen to be put in the position that it's in. I mentioned a few times this right answer that irrationality and rationality both seek to get, and I'll explore a little bit later what that right answer exactly is. My first question to examine is very simple. I strongly believe that what we consider rationality is just a controlling construct, but that leaves the question of who made it and for what purpose. Thus, my first question is, who benefits from rationality? The answer is easy. We all do. Well, sort of, sometimes. We all have the privilege of rationality at some point in our lives. Originally, rationality was sort of made up by rich white men who wanted to hold intellectual superiority over people they didn't want in power. A lot of early modern literature about gender suggests that women were irrational and therefore unsuited to positions of power or even unsuited to equality. Of course, that stereotype about women is still somewhat present today, but I think issues of rationality might relate more to questions of race and disability in our modern age. Because of increased equality and social justice movements, we've gotten to the point in society where we all benefit from rationality at some point. However, I believe we may have sort of gone the wrong way with those social justice movements. Instead of trying to fit the standards of systems of thought that seek to oppress us, I want to instead become more accepting of what we consider irrationality. Considering I'm very white and not incredibly well versed on that particular pieces of intersectionality, I'm mainly going to keep my exploration in the realm of neurodivergency and disability instead of race, which is a topic I don't have a lot of experience with. I also think that disabilities are an excellent example of a them versus us in group out group situation and maybe a little easier to understand than complicated issues of race and gender. There's an idea that we're willing to accept things that differ from the norm so long as they attempt to be normal, or we only accept them to a degree. We accept feminism more often from straight white women, but find it harder to swallow when it comes from a Black, trans, disabled woman, for example. Things that go against the norm are still okay if they fit that standard of rationality. Child with autism who can't make eye contact and plays with a fidget spinner is fine, but the adult having an overstimulated meltdown in the public place gets dirty look. Philosophers across time have suggested that we need an in-group and an out-group for society to thrive. People like Foucault theorized that we need to have something to rally against in order to rally at all. We have a very flexible standard for rationality to allow us to keep an in-group and an out-group. Like I said before, anyone can be in either group, no matter your background. An easy way to see that line is to take age as an example. Children and the elderly are judged to be unable to make decisions for themselves because they're irrational, so they get less freedom and even often less kindness than others. We treat our children like their experiences mean nothing. We belittle our elderly and sequester them away where we don't have to think about them. However, these people are far more capable of living intelligent, meaningful lives than we might assume. This extends to people with severe disabilities and of all races and genders. Just because we cannot understand someone's point of view doesn't mean it's wrong, and just because they sound irrational doesn't mean they don't have anything to teach us. It's at this point that I absolutely must talk about Ava Kate, if not to strengthen my own argument, then to at least convince you that you need to read her writing. I'm about to read you this very, very long quote, but please stick with me because it is totally worth it. Kate is writing about her severely disabled daughter and her mental limitations. This article is a huge foundation for my project, and I would be foolish to not read at least some of it as I segue into talking about disabilities. Kate says, they may well be weaker than my own, but Sesha has a strong and clear sense of herself. I cannot see that she experiences herself in any more of a discontinuous fashion than I experience myself. But this is not a conversation I can have with her. Does this mean that her life contains less good in it than yours or mine? Again, it is not a question I can answer. I feel quite certain that it is a life that contains a great deal of good in it, possibly more good than it of other individuals who qualify as persons worthy of a high degree of moral respect. Persons such as cognitively normal hedonic individuals, individuals who are incapable of joy, than people who live in misery, in abject poverty, and in war-torn lands, than people whose lives are devastated by addiction or emotionally painful afflictions. Sesha is capable of great joy and great love. Her life contains an immeasurable amount of good, and she further contributes to the creation of good in this world by her interactions with others. To walk into her home is to get an infusion of joy and energy, a possibility that is too rare in our sad world. Disabilities are a place where I think issues of rationality stand out most often. It may be an easier example to think of than race or gender because, as Kate talks about, disabilities are often labeled as inhuman. A disability immediately puts you into the out group because inhuman is really just another word for irrational. Rehabilitation and therapy are often focused on making people fit the norm, but is that really what it should be? Lots of disabilities and neurodivergent behavior are perfectly comfortable for the one experiencing them. They just inconvenience others. If that kind of behavior isn't hurting anyone, then why should it need to change? Is irrationality so bad that we should reject fundamental desires built into our own brains just to be rid of it? Of course not. Irrational behavior shouldn't be seen as something to be fixed, but just as a different way to experience the world. Getting rid of a standard of rationality opens us up to a whole new realm of learning about and accepting perspectives different from our own. So this all brings me to a very simple thought. Do we even need rationality? The answer to that is maybe not. Of course, norms and standards for behavior are bad for people with disabilities, but they're bad even for the healthiest of us. They keep us from experiencing views different from our own and lead to anxiety about our place in society. I'm sure everyone here has been in a situation where they're struggling and feel like they need help, but they're too afraid to ask for fear of judgment. To get rid of the idea that these typically irrational ideas are inherently bad, we can start to get rid of that stigma, and everyone will benefit from a more accepting and diverse society. So with all that being said, I'm pleased to announce that we don't actually need rationality at all. Actually, scratch that. I think maybe we do need some rationality. Just some, though. Try as I might across the course of this project, I have not been able to figure out a way to leave behind rationality entirely. And trust me, I have tried. Remember how I described rationality as presenting itself as the only right way to get the right answer when in reality there are many? In this theory, the right answer is a happy and moral life, eudaimonia, if you will. We can still be irrational and lead a good and moral life. Both rationality and irrationality can lead to bad things as well. In a way, there are constructive and destructive versions of both rationality and irrationality. My argument is that we need to find a spot in our society for constructive irrationality and reject the destructive irrationality instead of accepting it for the sole reason of because it's rationality. I can't let go of rationality solely because of what it does for morality. I think moral standards are incredibly important and we need them if we want society to flourish. Personally, I find behaviors that rise out of neurodivergency and mental illness pretty easy to swallow, and I think we should be more widely accepting of them. However, I have to draw the line at the desire to hurt oneself or others. At that point, rational or irrational, that behavior requires help. Because of that, I've determined that standards for behavior or rationality are still important when it comes to morality. Of course, suggesting that does hurt some of my argument. This whole time I've been focused on getting rid of an in-group, out-group situation, and all I've done is just make another one when it comes to morality. I've somewhat backtracked on my original thought, but I feel like I can still make it work. I do believe that we can have a standard for morality without having a toxic in-group, out-group situation. This requires a philosophy of love instead of condemnation, something I'm confident would be difficult to achieve. However, starting small and opening up to constructive irrational behavior helps us move on to the next step of not outright demonizing destructive behavior. It would certainly be a difficult process, but I think it would come over time with more acceptance of rationality. At this point, I'm starting to get a little beyond the scope of my project, so I'll need to call it quits soon. Besides, from this point forward, I can confidently say that Bell Hooks's philosophy of love will say what I want to say far more eloquently than I could, so I strongly suggest you read that if you find this final idea at all interesting. I want to conclude by thanking you all for joining me today. I feel like I've rambled nonsensically for hours now, but it has been a mighty fun ramble, and I'm very glad to have had an audience for it. I absolutely love the experience of getting to explore my own thought instead of relying on prior philosophy to guide me. It's been a real blast, and I'm especially grateful to Jacob and to Dr. Huff for helping guide me through the process. So with all that being said, I'd love to take some time now for questions and comments, and even just more general discussion. Thank you, guys. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so I can actually see everybody.
Questions?
Yes, Dr. Turney, please.
I don't want to go first again, so I'll reserve a second spot if someone wants to go first. If not, I'll talk. But
oh, I'll go ahead and jump in if you're not interested to take this off.
Go ahead.
So I'm curious there, particularly towards the end, Hannah. I'm wondering if in your research, your ideas putting this together, if you encountered the hippies of the 60s, and this sounds like a very acceptance, peace, and love kind of notion. I'm curious if you see your work as growing out of that, or is something entirely different.
I mean, probably not entirely different. I definitely didn't pull much from any specific group of thought, though it is very much peace, love, and acceptance, which I'm all down for. A huge foundation of this whole project was my feminist theory course that I took with Dr. Turney, which pretty much created the entire idea in my mind. And a lot of that comes from more of a peace, love, and acceptance, especially I mentioned Ava Kate and Bell Hooks, which is very much a philosophy that the two of them buy into a lot. Bell Hooks literally writes the philosophy of love, which is all about accepting and loving people and making that into a system of thought that can guide us. So it definitely comes out of there, that sort of hippie view, which I'm cool with. If my project gets labeled with oh, this is all about acceptance and love, I'm cool, awesome. I feel good about that. Yeah.
Can I jump in too?
Yeah, of course.
So you define rationality as keeping some in power, as a construct to keep some people in power and to oppress others.
Yes.
And I would say a more traditional definition of rationality is using logic and reason.
Lame,
So
get out of here. Bad definition.
Bad definition. So I'm curious about that, because when you start looking at it from a logic and reason standpoint, there are rules to determine validity and truth, right? So are you basically saying in irrationality, there doesn't need to be validity or truth?
So I make a point at the start to differentiate rationality as a construct. Traditionally, we might think of rationality as reason or logic, but I think it's a lot different. Reason and logic is a lot different from the version of rationality that really rules our lives these days. And I think it would be easier to just say reason and logic versus rationality, because I feel like the two are very distinct. So I think that there can be reason and logic in irrationality, And there can be a lack of reason and logic within rationality as well. I feel like distinctly separating the two is a very big part of my project. All right, Dr. Turner, you want to go?
Yeah, I guess sort of as a follow-up to the greater Gutzwiller there, I do think that the relationship with logic and reason is complicated, and I heard it in your playing around with how you tried to leave it behind and just couldn't, where you were kind of flirting around with that part of your paper, and I guess I wonder why you didn't go in the direction of sort of non-canonical philosophical writing, especially as an English major, thinking of like poetic writing, satire, the kind of laugh of the Medusa that Cixous talks about. It's not incoherent, and so it, in some sense, makes sense, and it's sort of grabbing the power piece for oneself. So I wondered about exploring that in terms of methodology, because you were awfully reasonable.
Yes, I addressed that a little bit in my paper where I'm like, the way that I'm writing and presenting this is in and of itself following a standard of rationality that I think is harmful. So it's sort of hypocritical for me to like be here in this position in college, writing this article, thinking the way that I think, like down to the very bare bones of like my systems of thought, I feel like is almost tainted by a type of rationality that I don't enjoy. But I can't leave it behind.
My second point is that the stuff about morality, I guess, surprised me, but I did think that later for this issue about disability, the sort of counting severely disabled minds as voters. There's that movement following Kate, is exciting and very troubling, right? Sort of knowing what someone would want who can't say, or knowing what's in their interest and not sounding paternalistic. So I didn't know, that made me feel a little bit more, that might have been more of a connection, but otherwise I was wondering about that connection between this and morality.
I actually don't think I've made any explicit connection so far between morality and disability, but like I'd definitely be interested in exploring that, because like you're totally right. There's a very interesting connection there. I don't think I've explored it too very much. All right, Jesse, you want to go for it?
My question was mostly the first part of her question. So I guess there's a piece of that to follow up to, which is that you were mentioning that a society has to have some form of rationality to establish the norms and the structure. And you were saying establishing a structure where there is room for irrationality and space made for it, and a system that doesn't affect morals is the way forward. But if that system, structure, and society are defined by rationality and established norms, how do you stop that from starting to define which pieces of irrationality are allowed in, and then adopting that into that system, because we're understanding irrationality through the lens of rationality inherently?
Yeah, that's definitely a part where I really start to struggle. And every time I fall back on Foucault, because I read a lot of Foucault over January, all about like in-group and out-group and how we can never, ever be rid of it. And so I sort of keep getting caught up in that loop, where I do recognize that even if I manage to like get rid of sort of a norm for, rationality and accept irrationality to society, that's just going to become a norm as well. And then it's just going to be a more like effective in-group, out-group situation. And I guess at that point, I start to get into bell hooks, where I have to fall back on the idea that to have any sort of meaningful change in this like area is going to require like a shift in how we think about ourselves and our fellow humans on like a monumental scale. So I feel like at that point, I start to get beyond the scope of what I want to work on in my project, but I think it's possible. It just requires a like completely different idea of, what we consider to be humanity and how we consider ourselves in relation to our fellow humans. It's tough stuff. I haven't figured it out yet. I think I had Dr. Gardner next.
Yeah, I am impressed with the questions and with your answers to them. I was thinking in the course of your last answer that sort of an anthropology emerged, like you kept talking about a fundamental shift in our conception of humanity. And going back to the sort of question relative to hippie movement, that's a recurring dynamic that we can think about the European Enlightenment and the Romantic movement as a response as a challenge to say we're not reducible to the intellect alone, but that there are these other dimensions where the creative animal, where the artistic animal, where the loving animal, the passionate animal, in addition to Aristotle's the rational animal. And so maybe instead of making a juxtaposition of rationality versus irrationality, to just try to have an integrated vision, which I think you really touched on with your reference to eudaimonia. And that if we look at it in the way that Aristotle's framing it, but we don't have to be attached to Aristotle's frame, but the idea of there is a mean between the extremes, that's the good, but that's going to vary for every individual. That allows us to observe that there are general rules that apply, and yet those rules don't apply without modification for each individual and their perspective. And that allows us to integrate these two in a similar way that we can integrate the Romantics in the Enlightenment era by saying, well, we're the rational animal plus, right? And so that I think kind of where you went in your argument, ultimately, you came back to, it's not as sexy and fun to say like, maybe we don't need rationality, but really a focus on how it signifies, what we mean by rationality. And I think you're absolutely right that what emerges is rationality as a discourse for, I think, something that's interesting to integrate with Jacob's paper, really, for the opposition to instinct and all things not intellectual, and then the associations of those with categories like male and all sorts of categories of privilege. So that if you can be more explicit, drawing on Foucault or bell hooks about how this category is used in a power discourse, right? And then bring it into juxtaposition with an integrated experience of human nature as entailing not only multiple perspectives, but for each of us, right? Both rationality and irrationality, advocacy for the whole. But do you feel like first you have to establish the importance of irrationality before you can advocate for the integration?
I think so. I think I'm still at the point where I'm focusing on, bringing irrationality into the picture at all. It relates a little bit to the final I wrote for Freedom last year, where I actually wrote about irrationality and instinct and like how free are we from our own desires and things like that. And I think like that's probably the closest I've gotten to being able to integrate the two. And I think in that paper, I was essentially saying there is no such thing as irrationality or rationality. It's all just human behavior. It's all just instinct. It's all just how we're living our lives. And I think I may have gone a little too hard and fast with that one and probably skipped out on a lot of the like, this is why it's important to actually like bring in a frame of rationality into our lives. So it's really where I'm trying to like get into now is just like picking up why it's important to have any sort of rationality. But I do think you're right. Like my end goal is probably just there's none of either of them. There's no rationality or irrationality. It's all just accepted human behavior.
I think it's very productive to look, as you are doing, at agency and how that situates an individual relative to the community, and how these categories can constrain, agency and boundaries of community. But also, those are the categories that would allow for productive integration, both as individuals and collectively. So I think, even if you're pushing it far to the boundaries, that will help you figure out where the action's happening. And I think those are good categories.
Thank you. Jacob, do you have a question?
Yeah. And this is something that we've talked about plenty of times. But and I'm also sensing it a little bit from other people's questions, but to what extent do you think emotion would play a role in this irrational view? I know we've had a lot of conversations, particularly about how a lot of the times the sort of, I guess, the ultra rational approach doesn't do a good a job accounting for human emotion. and that we can have these other approaches where human emotion serves as, when with the metaphor used with the math problem, human emotion is an alternate way to get at solving the math problem, as it were. So what, I guess it's kind of open-ended, but what do you think, I guess, to what extent do you think emotion would play a role in the irrationality that you're posing?
Yeah, so I think emotion totally has a role in irrationality. I felt like, though, I didn't want to mention it too much because I thought dividing rationality and irrationality into intellectual versus emotional was probably a bit of an oversimplification, because I have certainly had moments in my life that I have felt like were irrational that were totally intellectual. I had totally reasonable, logical thought on the situation, but to anyone else's outside view, I was acting like a totally insane person. But to me, it was totally reasonable.
On the opposite end, sometimes we have emotions that are totally irrational. If someone comes up and punches you, getting angry,
I'm angry now.
a perfectly rational response to that.
Yes, so I feel like emotion totally plays into it. Sort of the idea, the phrase that I had at the very start of this was the phrase "facts don't care about your feelings" was a big part of me exploring this, because I think that's just such an interesting that phrase embodies the issue with rationality, in a very, very big way, and it tends to lean more to the political scope of things, but it really does get into the idea of well, there's an objective truth about the world, and it doesn't matter what your irrational feelings are on the matter when we have a rational truth that we can hold on to. So I think emotions are definitely more tied to rationality, but I didn't want to conflate the two, considering how difficult it is to actually draw that line. Yeah, I don't know who was next, if it was the Bakers or if it was Beverly. I do not remember. Well, one of you can volunteer to go first. Go for it.
Call on somebody.
I'll let the Bakers go.
And I want to ask you an English major question.
Of course, always.
In terms of your diagnoses of the way our civilization has been flowing, I don't know if I quite buy your argument about the power that rationality has, because it seems to me that Wordsworth and those guys won the day. And Alexander Pope, for example, is a footnote now. And in all the arts, what was celebrated is that sort of Dionysian impulse, and it ends up in things like Finnegan's Wake. So do you really think since you're in the arts and literature, English and American literature, don't you think irrationality really won?
See, I think it did in some directions, but I would say Wordsworth and a lot of people who were writing during that romantic period are all very privileged white men who are coming from a position where they are the top of society. They are making the rules for what good poetry is for everyone else. And if you start to make poetry or any sort of art that doesn't fit their standards, your art is void, null and void. So I think there's certainly there's totally a degree of irrationality in the arts, though I think it probably has more to do with people who aren't making the rules of the time, right? Because you can write something that is full of emotion and beauty and art and irrational, but if it's still following the rules presented by one group of people who are dominating a specific field, I think it's still definitely following the terms of rationality.
Well, I was thinking when Wordsworth says we murder to dissect, he's saying what you're saying, isn't he?
Probably a little bit. I think there's definitely some overlap. I know all of those, poets and stuff are focused on separating themselves from the norms of society. I'm just not sure how willing I am to accept their idea of separation as a good form of irrationality. I think it's still very much tied to a rational desire.
Hello.
Hello, Grandpa.
We don't have our picture because we're having a bad hair day.
Well, I mean, I get that.
Hey, my question to you, that two groups that are come up to mind for me that are have irrational parts are the autism group and people with addictions. And what I kind of wanted to know is, what would be one of your ways that you would try to turn the irrational thoughts about these two groups around to be more rational, even though they would still be irrational to most people?
Well, in general, I think I'm not even focused on like making thought about them like or about any two groups more rational. I'm more focused on being like, it's okay to accept that this is an irrational behavior, like way to behave. Like it is good for people to act irrationally. And I hadn't really thought about addictions too much, though I'm sure you would know a whole lot more about that than me, considering like the work you do. So I would definitely be interested in getting into that some more. I think that's a point where I like start to get into the issue of like rationality and morality, where I feel like, you know, if someone is in danger of like hurting themselves or others, there needs to be a certain degree of a standard for behavior. And that's where I start to, you know, get into the spot where I have to backtrack a little bit. But in general, like, I feel like for autism specifically, I was thinking about that a whole lot as I was writing this. The idea of just like accepting or encouraging people to accept that behavior different from their own is not bad. It's just, you know, irrational, and it's good to accept that irrationality. We don't have to feel the pressure to make it more rational. We can just accept it as it is in like the realm of irrationality.
So for all the people in addiction, their irrational behavior is totally rational to themselves.
Yeah, totally.
And so that if you can find a way to let people know that their mind is short-circuited somewhere, and that rational or irrational is rational to them. And a lot of people just don't understand that. And that's why they make comments about different groups and that, and not nice. But Grandma has a question for you.
Oh, yes. Hello.
Hello. I have a very simple question.
Of course.
Does irrationality beget chaos?
No way. And if it does, it's a good chaos. It's the spice of life kind of chaos, you know, the chaos that we all like and enjoy. I think irrationality, the way that I'm defining it, can be like totally like calm and collected behavior. And there's some types of rationality that can incite total chaos. Though I think if anything, if rationality or irrationality is inciting chaos, it's the fun kind more times than it's the bad kind.
Perhaps it's only fun if you are irrational by nature. If you are
that's
a
the
person
point where we gotta
likes to follow
reconcile like everyone's beliefs. I can recognize that what might be fun for someone else might not be fun for me, but I have to recognize that the way they're behaving isn't bad, it's just different.
Okay. Gotcha.
Chloe, do you have a question?
Yeah, so just thinking about like my own experience and what I kind of know about neurodiversities and such, I am curious what you think. I know you said that the whole goal of kind of your argument is to be more accepting of people who are different, essentially. But I guess my question is, in some cases, I think being irrational not only should just be accepted, but sometimes it can be beneficial to society because it makes them think differently. And like, I know dyslexics are like 40% of self-made millionaires. I know artists and especially like musicians today, a lot of the times tend to be bipolar. Like there are cases like that where obviously they have differences. Obviously there are struggles associated with it. But I wonder if it's more than just acceptance, and maybe there's an aspect to it that's also, maybe their differences give a perspective that is necessary for human life. And I just want to know what you thought about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that. I'm starting off with like acceptance, just because it's a little bit easier, but I definitely think like all of these different perspectives that I'm looking at and like suggesting that we need are things that we need to have like a full and like complete view of human life. I think that to have like a full and fulfilling like society, there needs to be irrationality and rationality both. All right, Mr. Josh Brown.
Miss Anna Gutzwiller, hello. I just wanted to, I ask a very similar question to what I asked Jacob, that I think that there's a really good like self-awareness of your paper, that you're rational in your argument, and that people have asked today about like how people in the arts are generally uplifted for acting irrationally or depicting irrationality. And I want to know what you think like actionable change in the world of specifically philosophy would look like, embracing this kind of irrational thought and uplifting it and taking away rational thought from the pedestal that it is in philosophy.
Oh man, Josh, that is a great question. I think in general, I've been thinking about this a lot because I'm getting to the point where I'm trying to decide if I want to go into graduate school. And I really struggle because the like hyper intellectual theoretical a part of philosophy does not apply to me at all. I don't like it. I don't enjoy doing it. It's not very fun. But when I get a chance to apply philosophy to like a real world issue, I just think that is like the coolest thing in the world. I think that like incredibly intellectual, like theoretical stuff is just so unnecessary. And I think like that's the point where we start to get into like, I feel like I could make actionable change if maybe philosophy was willing to take a step back from the hardcore theoretical and intellectual and actually apply to like solving issues and apply like their thought and knowledge and incredible wisdom into something that is a little bit more concrete and a little bit more like realistic to talk about in our day-to-day. Because I feel like so much of what I read philosophy that is, I don't feel this way with a lot of older philosophy, but I read contemporary or modern philosophy and I'm just like, who is this helping? How is this at all helpful? I feel like you're just stroking your own ego. You're not doing anything that's really helping anybody. And that's not the point of philosophy at all. So I think just philosophy in and of itself could probably stand to focus a little bit more on, you know, the actuality of the situation, reality, and how to actually make change on that scale versus on a theoretical or intellectual scale, making it more accessible, perhaps. I got Quinn.
Hello. So I actually can't figure out how to phrase this as a question, but I did have a comment that I at least wanted to say.
Go for it.
I very much appreciated the way you kind of navigated the issues concerning the in-group and the out-group, and how rationality can kind of create, well, rationality, as you described it, can create a space in which the people who are like in charge and like deciding that rationality kind of dictate what things can and can't be kind of added to the space and are valuable to the space. And I definitely see that as a very poignant issue when we're talking about philosophy specifically, because philosophy in general is a very, like when we look at the people who we say like, who are the most like prolific philosophers, it's generally like white men, right? And there are a lot of Black philosophers that don't even get called philosophers, despite having very kind of poignant philosophies, like people like W.E.B. Du Bois or like Frederick Douglass or Angela Davis. They all have some very interesting philosophies, and yet I never hear about them in like classes or the larger philosophical space unless I do any like deep digging for myself. And I feel like that has a lot to do with the fact that the people who've kind of decided what is rational for philosophy have this idea in mind of like what makes like a good philosophy. We have like Descartes, we have Hume. And I think in this instance, especially in terms of philosophy, this space could definitely do with a little bit of irrationality and welcoming in some of those voices that don't fit the typical mold, but definitely have very valuable, insightful things to say. And I think that was a very beneficial aspect of your argument.
Yeah, thank you. I totally agree. I think philosophy could definitely benefit from that just in general. I think we focus a little bit too much on what's easily palatable. Sarah, do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm not really sure how to phrase this either, but I was thinking about how after Jacob's talk, we were talking about how humans have like sort of a mouthpiece. And I think after yours that we could like narrow it down even further that only like quote unquote rational people, especially if they're non-minorities, have a mouthpiece. And you also mentioned that like civil rights movements and those kind of things generally try to gain a mouthpiece using rationality. And I was just wondering how you think we should like move forward in that. Do you think that people who kind of have more of a choice of rationality or irrationality should let our irrationality out more? Like, how do you think that we can move forward? Because I don't think that people who are minorities, like they don't have a mouthpiece. So them just being irrational, but yet still having a great, productive, loving life or whatever is necessarily how we would create change. So how do you think, going forward that we could try to eventually shift it in a way that more people would have a mouthpiece that are called irrational?
Sort of like you hit the nail on the head when you like maybe people who are irrational should really like start practicing irrationality. I think like that's a big part of it. I definitely struggle with some issues of like neurodivergency. And recently I've been like, I don't want to be masking as much because I don't like the way it makes me feel. And I don't owe it to anybody to act in a way that is different from the way that I want to act. And I think like we're starting to get to that with questions of like race and gender, people who are like, I am going to be unapologetically this way. I am going to unapologetically act in a way that is best for my racial situation, for who I am as a person. I am going to be, I've especially really loved like something that I love about social media is seeing the different ways that people like present their genders. And seeing people who are like, I don't care the way I look, like I am going to just unrepentantly, unapologetically dress this way, act this way, and I'm going to go by these pronouns. And you know what? Nobody's going to tell me differently. And I feel like accepting that sort of irrationality and encouraging people to like be unapologetically themselves and not try and conform to that standard is probably like a huge way that we get into, actually accepting it. And I can definitely say like seeing people act that way and seeing people be unapologetically them really helps me like encourage myself to do the same. So I think like that's step one is just like getting everyone to be a little bit more comfortable deviating from rationality or deviating from the norm. Any more questions?
I can just make the comment that I was observing in your response, also in Quinn's questions, that I think maybe in the tradition of pragmatism that Du Bois was engaging in, and which informs the work of figures like bell hooks, that you might find a methodology that allows you to observe what emerges as the application of philosophy in terms of social work as a field, and also an idea about sort of the contextualization of rationality. But I think Du Bois is a good example, but that strand of pragmatism throughout kind of really wrestles with the epistemology, like what do we do with conflicting claims of rationality, and tries to come with a single standard measure. And that measure is, what does it do? Right, which points right to your response in terms of the theoretical debates don't matter to me unless they have practical application. So I think you might find some resources there that will help you enrich at least your ability to address different kinds of audiences who have that background as well.
Absolutely. You've all given me some great things to talk about. Now that I'm finishing up this paper, I've got so much more research and writing to do now.
Maybe I'll be so bold as to ask one maybe quick question. So I've got two characters and I'd like you to try to locate on your spectrum, given how you understand rationality and irrationality. Socrates and Jesus.
Both very, very irrational people, simply by the fact that they were completely going against what society wanted them to be. Both of them were, literally killed by their beliefs and the way they acted. So I think it's probably, I feel comfortable saying that both of them were very irrational people, at least in the way that we think about irrationality now. Now, they were perfectly reasonable and, I don't know if I'd be willing to say that both Socrates and Jesus were at all times reasonable and logical, but they certainly presented their arguments. They were not what you would think of sort of deranged lunatics, though maybe Socrates was a little bit. But they both definitely they were both irrational people. I feel comfortable saying that. All right, well, thank you guys so much for asking so many wonderful questions.
Thank you. This has been really wonderful.